The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States. In addition, jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba, while the necessary air bases are being prepared. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Darren Woods, General Director of Fort Worth Opera, and thank you all for braving the cold. These symposia, as many of you know, were sort of came together last year when we thought, why don't we have a series of talks with our community about the things that President Kennedy was wrestling with over 50 years ago and the things that are still meaningful and we're talking about today. So this is the third in that series, Cuba and Immigration, timely in many ways. I'd like to start by thanking Juana Rosa and Ron Danielle, who are tonight's sponsors. And where are you? Somewhere. There they are over in the corner. And I would also, none of this would be possible without a grant the generous grant from Opera America and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So we always want to thank Opera America and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Our moderator and host tonight is James Riddlesperger, Professor of Political Science at TCU. Jim is a native of Denton, Texas, a proud native of Denton, Texas. He's taught at TCU since 1982. The winner of the 2012 Honors Professor of the Year Award at TCU, he's co-author of several books, including Lone Star Leaders, The Austin-Boston Connection, Texas Politics, co-editor of The Right Stuff, TCU Press, and Presidential Leadership and Civil Rights. He has also published more than 36 scholarly articles and 24 entries in encyclopedias. A frequent consultant to news, media, locally and across the nation concerning politics and elections, he's a past president of the Southern Political Science Association. Please welcome Dr. Jim Riddlesperger.
Thank you so much. That was far too much. But we have a very impressive panel tonight. And we're going to have, I hope, a wonderful discussion about issues regarding Cuba and our memories of the Kennedy administration, but also bringing it forward to issues of relationships between the United States and the nations of the Caribbean, of Central America and South America, and of course our closest neighbor, Mexico. And we have an impressive panel to talk about all of those things. Carlos Fonts is our first guest. Carlos is the managing partner of HOS Energy, Highland Oil Systems in Dallas. He's been in more than 30 years in the oil business and has a very impressive record there. The reason that he's here tonight is his experience before that, though. Mr. Fonts was born in Havana, where he attended primary and secondary school. While attending college in the United States in 1959, the Castro regime took over Cuba. He immediately ceased attending college and returned to Cuba. Upon his return to Cuba, his father passed away, and he became responsible for moving his mother, married sisters, and their families to the United States. At the age of 19, he volunteered for the Brigade 2506, which became involved in the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion. Mr. Fonts became the executive officer of the underwater demolition team and among the first to land at the Bay of Pigs. When the battle was lost, he was asked to volunteer and return with the U.S. Navy to rescue survivors with a team of 5 men. He stayed for about 18 months with the CIA thereafter. His experiences are many, and I look forward to hearing his reflections on that time. He is the recipient of the National Freedom Award by Cardinal Vicente Foundation. He's a former member of the Council on Foreign Relations, currently a trustee in the Institute of World Politics based in Washington, D.C. IWP is an accredited graduate school of national security and international affairs dedicated to developing leaders with a sound understanding of international realities and ethical conduct of statecraft. Mr. Fox lives in Dallas, Texas with his wife of 51 years, Regina. Regina's here somewhere. She doesn't have to oh, there she is in the back. And they have 5 children and 15 grandchildren, all living in Dallas. So we could win that battle with Dallas if we could just get them to move over here, all just by themselves. I'm very jealous of that because I have 1 grandchild and 2 children, and only half of my children, and only half. I have a grandchild now and 1 coming, and the other half, have moved to New Jersey. So I need to talk with you about your secrets. Okay. Yeah. Oh, that's what it is. Oh, okay. I could do that. Okay. John Hernandez is also with us tonight. John is the first of our John Hernandezes. He is an accomplished businessman. His diverse career path has allowed him to obtain extensive experience in client management, business development, operations management, and community involvement. He has been since July the president and CEO of Fort Worth Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. He served as board member before that and brings a lot of organizational history to the organization. That experience allows him to understand and address the challenges faced by small business owners and entrepreneurs. In addition, Hernandez has worked in corporate settings, first as a private banker with the Bank of America and subsequently as vice president of J.P. Morgan's Fort Worth Wealth Management team. John holds his B.A. from Midwestern State University in beautiful Wichita Falls, Texas, where he was selected to participate in an international internship to study at Tec de Monterrey in Chihuahua, Mexico. He also went on to receive his MBA at Southern Methodist University, for which I'll forgive him. And John is a native Texan and a passion for classic cars and supports stay-in-school initiatives. So despite the fact that he's from SMU, welcome, and I say that lovingly. Dr. David LaFevor is a professor of Latin American history and digital humanities at UT Arlington. He earned his PhD and master's degrees at Vanderbilt University and has a bachelor's degree from Rhodes College in Memphis. He writes about Latin American cultural and social history of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He's most interested in the ideas of modernity, masculinity, transnationalism, and national identities in Mexico and Cuba, so he'll be very helpful tonight. He teaches a wide array of courses, from undergraduate surveys of Latin American history to upper division seminars on Cuba and Mexico, and graduate courses on race, national identity, and gender in Latin America. His current book project traces racial, national, and gendered contours of the introduction and popularization of boxing in Cuba and Mexico from the 1890s to the 1930s. He's a director of the British Library Endangered Archives Program project, creating a digital archive of ecclesiastical sources from Trinidad's Santiago, Bayamo, and Baracoa, Cuba, which focuses on digitizing, preserving, and publishing documents pertinent to the African diaspora in Cuba. Finally, last but definitely not least, our second John Hernandez, Juan this time. Juan Hernandez is with us tonight. Juan is from Fort Worth. And his father is from Guanajuato, Mexico, and his mother is a native of Fort Worth. So he has always been someone with his feet in both cultures. He completed his undergraduate studies at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, received his master's and doctoral degrees at a better university than SMU, TCU. I'm kidding. I just had to compare the Johns. Juan has dedicated himself to the study of Latin America-U.S. relations for many years. He's been a professor at various universities, creating a Center for the U.S.-Mexico Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas. In 1996, He became associated with Vicente Fox, then the governor of the Mexican state of Guanajuato, to speak at UT Dallas and meet George W. Bush, then the governor of Texas, a historical meeting that marked a new outlook in Mexico-U.S. relations. During this Texas trip, Fox asked Dr. Hernandez to help create Guanajuato trade offices in the United States, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Dallas-Fort Worth, and serve as his representative in the U.S. Soon, Fox invited Hernandez to be the gatekeeper and close confidant to his presidential campaign, and after beating the party that had ruled Mexico for 71 years, President Fox hired Hernandez as the first U.S.-born cabinet member heading the president's office for Mexicans abroad. Operating from Los Pinos, the Mexican White House, the office had as its principal objective to serve and dignify the 24 million people that President Fox has called heroes, the countrymen who live in foreign lands. Hernandez is currently an advisor to the presidential candidates in international corporations in various countries, keeps an office in Washington, D.C. and Mexico City, and lives here in Fort Worth. He's been featured on the cover of Fortune magazine, honored as the Humanitarian of the Year by Latin Trade, listed as one of the 100 most influential Hispanics by Hispanic Business Magazine. In recent years, he's become well known for his passionate defense of the rights of immigrants and support for comprehensive immigration reform, and has been showcased on Nightline, The Peter Jennings Show, and is a regular on CNN, Univision, Fox News, and MSNBC. Hernandez has written 5 books, 3 of poetry and 2 on international politics. Yes, Dr. Hernandez is a poet and a politician, which is a really, really interesting combination. He also can sing mariachi if we actually push him. You might want him involved. I've known Juan for many, many years. He and I team taught a class at TCU the year before last, and today is especially noteworthy for him because his grandchild is 1 year old today. So he came anyway, okay? So we have a very distinguished set of panelists. Please welcome them. Let me just get this affair started by kind of talking. My goal here is to allow these very talented people to frame issues in their own way. I have no agenda here, unlike it seems like in every other setting we have talking about history or politics these days. We're going to talk about immigration policy, but if you want nastiness and yelling, please watch any presidential debate, and we're going to avoid that. We want to have really a conversation that will include you all about issues of the past and present. And I think that we can do that with this group that we have. So the Kennedy time was a very interesting time in U.S. history because the United States has always had a special relationship with nations in the Caribbean, in Central America, and South America. Obviously, we share the same hemisphere. We share much of the same destiny, and at least since the Monroe Doctrine, the United States has seen the Caribbean and South America as part of an international organization for which we take that we're a member of. And so it's a long-term relationship. But when President Kennedy came to office, obviously, he wanted to do 2 things. One is he wanted to exploit the relationships between the United States and Central and South America to try to make economic development and political development take place in ways that were beneficial not only for the United States but also for those nations. The Alliance for Progress has been analyzed by historians, and it gets very mixed assessments. David, you might want to speak to that. I don't know. But at least it represented an effort that was really groundbreaking between the United States and Central America and South America. And of course, the context of that was that it was part of the Cold War, and particularly part of the policy of containment. The idea that the United States had was that there was enough communism in the Western Hemisphere, in Cuba, And of course, at the 1960 election and during 1961, in the early days of the Kennedy presidency, and I think Carlos may talk about that a little bit in a few minutes, that became a huge issue in the United States. And one of the ways to combat the potential for the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere was, of course, to have a developmental project like the Alliance for Progress. So they dovetailed with one another. So what I'm going to do is kind of go around the panel, and I think I'll start with Carlos and say, what are your reflections about that period in American history? What do you remember about the Kennedy years? What things do you think we should take from that? And of course, for me, I don't remember the Bay of Pigs particularly, but I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis very, very well. It took place over my 10th birthday. And it interfered with the celebration thereof, and so I remember it well from a very selfish 10-year-old perspective. But Carlos, very early in the Kennedy administration, they inherited a plot from the Eisenhower administration, fostered by Allen Dulles and others, that they thought that if we could just put a few expatriates of Cuba on shore in Cuba, that surely Cuba would come back to thinking straight and join with the United States in defeating Fidel Castro. So, Carlos, could you tell us a little bit about that time and your memories of that time?
Sure. I was in, after I took my family out of Cuba, I went back to college, and I found it very hard to concentrate in what I was supposed to do. And I got a call from a friend of mine, and it said, "Hey, Carlos, we're coming down from New York. We heard that they're recruiting people in Miami, and it's for an invasion in Cuba." And I thought, okay, finals next week or an invasion? So they picked me up, and there we go. And actually in the car, we were friends since Cuba. We were the first ones that I was always involved with the ocean, swimming, sailing, diving when nobody was doing that. And we said, well, it's an invasion, it's gonna be some frogman. So I think that's better. And so we went and volunteered for the what came the UDT, and that was an interesting experience. And I'll tell you a short story about that. This is a beautiful CIA. Later, I was an officer in the United States Navy. I learned how to do things right. But the CIA had always this plans to recruitment, and apparently there were like 40 candidates to be a frogman, underwater demolition team. They picked us up. They told us in the middle of the night, show up in this bowling alley. We're going to pick you up. And we went to this house in I think it was Homestead. It was in the middle of nowhere. And you can see everything was taped. And we were filed down into this back of this house. There was this huge pool, had the lights on like Florida, very clear. And they told us only to bring a short and to strip down and have our bathing suit under. So we did. So we gathered around this pool, and the head guy said, okay, now what we're gonna do, you're gonna go in the water, okay? And once you go in the water, you cannot hold on to the side of the pool. And I thought to myself, my God, and whoever goes to the side of the pool and hangs out is gonna disqualify, we take him out. And I thought, we're gonna be here 3 days waiting in the water. What I didn't know is that all night, they had dumped huge blocks of ice in that pool. So if you can imagine when I saw the Titanic and people diving in that water, that's what I imagined. I only had a small orange juice because I knew we were going to exercise, and one thing you don't want is have the big breakfast. And I hit the water, we realized what was happening. People start throwing up, and they start going down, and finally they narrowed down to 12. And all the other guys that were taken to the bus and shipped out, we were given a terry cloth bathrobe, and suddenly a cup of coffee. And that was the best coffee I had in my life because it did have a shot of brandy inside too. But that's how, and we were trained in Vieques, in the Caribbean. I would say when we had the film and you had the beginning, you see Kennedy and Jackie there with the flag. That's the flag of the brigade. That was at the Orange Bowl. And at that moment, I was able to talk to him that day because I was standing in front of our small group, and he came to talk to us. Now, Regina had more experience with him because her father went to prep school in Choate, and he was a suite mate for 4 years of her father. So Regina met him when she went to boarding school in New York. She used to meet him in New York as a senator and come and talk to them and have lunch with them or whatever. So anyway, there was a lot of hope at that time. A lot of, it was a time of hope. I will say briefly about Cuba. Cuba in the 50s, sure, we had our problems. Castro was in the mountains, all that. But in general, the country was great. It was like a paradise. We had the biggest middle class in Latin America. We exported food and products. We had more cars per capita than the United States. We had more color TVs than the United States. We had the first plants of color TV in the world, after the United States. We had the best social laws protection for the workers. We had like maternidad obrera. Maternidad obrera is like if a woman is pregnant, she gets 2 months before having the baby and 3 months afterwards. And now you don't have the great revolution, quote, revolution of Castro. Basically, if you want to go there and put a joint venture and employ Cuban workers, they get paid in pesos, it goes to the government, and you can fire them and do whatever you want with them anytime. That's a great revolution. And the Cuba that I knew, which was was a great country. Unfortunately, we had corrupt governments, and that allowed Castro to come in, allow what has happened. And as my son says, the Cuba you knew, Dad, is gone. It's like Atlantis. It sank. The Cuba that exists now is a slum. It's slum. And there's no reason for it, only because of the regime in power. So now you know my political leanings about that. But the Bay of Pigs, naturally, the bad story about that is that when we went to the Bay of Pigs, the American Navy was there, right outside, going to Cuba with us. So we felt I said, okay, they're going to support us. We feel pretty good about that. And I was the first one to land, me and another guy, and the advanced beach. And I right away, and we did very well. We landed all the troops we were supposed to. But as soon as daylight came, by the way, they had bombed with B-26. Our B-26s are flying, which is World War II planes, all the way from Nicaragua to Cuba, all the military bases, trying to knock down all the Air Force of Castro. And one of the mistakes Kennedy made was that at the insistence of Bobby Kennedy and what was the head of the guy, Adlai Stevenson, they canceled the other 2 bombings, and therefore they left some planes on the ground of Castro, only few, which were enough, but went ahead with invasion. And by the way, I was going to say something briefly, and then I know we got to take turns, but the plan that Kennedy inherited from the Eisenhower administration, I think would have worked better. It would have planned to do, and this is where we're training, nucleus of guerrillas, and then infiltrating Cuba in the mountains here, there, suburban, or whatever, and because there was a lot of support against Castro at the time, because he was executing people without trial, they were doing horrible things already. And I think that plan worked better. The CIA then recommended an invasion. Now, we had the Pacific War. I was a Navy officer there, and I love American history, and especially American naval history. And if you go back to our Pacific landings, we always had superior forces. We also always had air superiority. So this plan that the CIA was in retrospect, ridiculous to have an invasion, a frontal invasion, with such weak forces. So we always thought we had the support of the United States. So in the middle of invasion, when they were shooting down Castro's Air Force started shooting our bombers, he didn't have any gunners in the tail and didn't have any fighters. It was like a turkey shoot. And sinking our ships, our jets were flying overhead, American jets. But they were ordered not to intervene. I'll cut the whole story short at this point, but I will tell you that I was very bitter at that time with the United States. I was asked to go back by the American Navy. I was the first one on my team to show up on the American ships, and a lot of the pilots and even commanding officers were crying I mean, they were very emotional because they said, we saw the whole thing. We had orders not to intervene. And later, after being 3 weeks in Cuba, getting people out of there, only the 5 of us, and getting them out at night, the thing that really turned my heart about the United States, because I've been an officer of the United States, I am totally an American, and I bleed for this country if I have to. I mean, I love the United States. But let me tell you what turned my heart. The last day I was wounded by a shell fragment until finally evacuated, and then the destroyer, they operated my foot to get this piece of metal, and they gave me, I guess they gave you morphine is what they give you, and I was out of it. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, this guy's waking me up, and he said, orderly, we'll have another shot of morphine. And as I'm talking to the guy, I'm saying, I don't want it. I've never liked drugs. And I said, I don't want it. And the guy kept insisting, sir, you have to have it. And suddenly the shadows came out of the floor. And what it was, the Marines, they have heard all the radio transmissions and all the little battles we had with rescuing people and the whole thing. And they found out I was there. And they came and put their mattresses on the floor, and they were watching me because they wanted to take care of me. And, and when this guy, orderly, was trying to give me a shot and insisting, suddenly this gunny sergeant emerged from the shadows, got his face on the guy and said, he says he doesn't want it. The guy backed out. And at that moment, I said, it's the government of the United States that made the mistake. And Kennedy later said he was a young president, ill-advised, he made the wrong moves, and it's not the people of the United States. And that turned my heart forever to be totally American. So that's...
Isn't it nice to have a president who actually admitted when he made a mistake?
That's right.
It's
That's
so
right.
lost from our political scenes these days. And we know about the cars in Cuba because they're still driving the very
That's right.
same cars. John, do you have memories of or thoughts about the Kennedy years?
You know, I was born in the 70s, so
Okay.
Well, I knew that.
Was in school, yes. And unfortunately, I don't have a great story like Carlos here, but you know, all I know are the cars and obviously the history books. But
Yeah.
My staff, my very great staff, gave me all the history and prep for tonight, and I tell you, I couldn't put it down. So it was just revisiting that was incredible.
It's a fascinating story, and in fact, the Bay of Pigs is such a fascinating story, as is the Cuban Missile Crisis. But unfortunately, we have to move on. David, what are your reflections on the Kennedy era, and particularly the Kennedy era, from the perspective of the Alliance for Progress, and more broadly than Cuba in the rest of Latin American stuff?
I also don't have a story to follow up on that great one.
Yeah, I think Carlos wins.
So most of my personal narratives from Cuba are from the last 10 years that I've lived there off and on. But to add to the video that we saw and from what Carlos said, one of the scariest things about this video is that we realized at the time that it was an extraordinary existential threat. But we didn't know until the 1990s the degree of that threat. So Kennedy was making these decisions based on invasion, based on blockade, with false information at hand. The amount of missiles that were already mounted and ready to be launched were in the dozens. We thought there were only a few. We didn't know this until Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, went to Cuba and met with Castro, and it got even more Orwellian than the fact that there were more missiles pointed at us. McNamara asked Castro, because he thought he had a bad translation, and he said, is this true that these were ready to go? And he said, yes, that's true. And he said, well, what would you have done had the U.S. invaded again? And we have to put ourselves and have some empathy with the Cuban government's perspective if we want to understand why and how these things happened. So the Bay of Pigs and the missiles were loaded into Cuba to prevent what they perceived was an imminent invasion, another Bay of Pigs. And they asked Castro, would you have launched the weapons? And he said, not only would I have launched them, I gave the order to launch them if there was an invasion. McNamara took a step back and he said, again, am I hearing this correctly? And Castro then evinced his willingness to sacrifice the entire island in the name of this confrontation. So for those days that we kind of stared down the gun barrel, we were a lot closer than we knew at that time. And one of the great things about, and unfortunate things about studying this era is that even today we're still getting new information to interpret this point in history. My specialty as a historian is a little bit further back in history, but I do work on the unique relationship between the United States and Cuba. So there's a tendency that we have to look at that as a bilateral relationship and to look at it in a sort of vacuum. But most people who were from Latin America at that point in time understood the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba in a little bit broader terms. So they would look at U.S. opposition to the Castro regime and say, well, in a way, it's kind of more of the same. The U.S. was instrumental in overthrowing a democratically elected government in Guatemala in 1954. This is where Che Guevara had cut his teeth. Then he filtered into Mexico, where he met Fidel Castro. So both sides here have very, very compelling arguments and very personal arguments. But I think it behooves us to kind of step back and look at it through an empathetic lens of the other side. Now, I still don't think we can ever justify Castro's willingness to sacrifice an entire island at that point of 4 or 5 million people. But we can at least understand the justification for a militaristic policy that sought to serve as a bastion against an invasion. All right. I'll leave it there at this point and answer questions later.
Juan, can you bring in some perspective about Mexico?
Well, not a whole lot with regard to JFK, except a little story, not like our dear Carlos Pons. I was a child living in Mexico City at that time, and I remember just as clear as anything, the kids would bring the newspapers every day to the house and sell them every day to the house. And so he's screaming, little kid, and he's screaming, "Mataron a Kennedy, mataron a Kennedy, mataron a Kennedy." And I'll never forget the entire nation of Mexico, but I remember Mexico City, just everything stopped pretty much. They killed this very, very popular president, very popular in Mexico. Just to, if I can, and if not, I won't have much to participate, but jump forward to December of 2000. December of 2000. There's a meeting of Chrétien, Fox, Prime Minister Chrétien, Canada, Vicente Fox, Mexico, George W., President of the United States. And they're talking about a new relationship between these three nations. In NAFTA, we could talk a lot about this relationship of the three countries, but creating somewhat of a block of three countries, not one nation, a block, similar in some ways to Europe. And Chrétien goes back, and he's not into it as much as Bush is and Fox, who had been wanting to do business since April of 1997 when they were both governors. And they decide to create what is called the Partnership for Prosperity, which could have been something like a NAFTA plus, taking even the NAFTA to even a greater relationship. And the next week, of course, we have September 11th, and we had gone in December, and then we'd gone back. I happened to be there a week before September 11th, and all these months preparing for incredible opportunities for the United States and Mexico and Canada, and one bombing of one enemy here. So, I mean, we can talk a lot about that happening in Cuba, but happening in this nation. And to be honest, we can talk about immigration, we can talk about the crazies in politics, and so much of that really has to do with the fear that was created that day, September 11th. But I'll leave it at that.
So I think this is a good opportunity for us to kind of move forward to that. I remember vividly the days when the border between the United States and Mexico was, there was a river there, but that was it. In the days when I was young and we would go to the border, if you had a dime, you could walk across the bridge and no one checked your credentials going either direction. And if you didn't have a dime, you could wade across the Rio Grande. I always thought that the term wetback was a pejorative, of course, but you didn't even have to get your knees wet to get to the United States from Mexico, much less your back, because and that was just generally accepted. I mean, there was no boundary that kept Mexicans from entering freely into the United States or Americans from entering freely into Mexico. And I think that was widely understood by Americans. It had begun to change as soon as we got NAFTA, and of course it has gotten tighter since then. What are the consequences of this changing atmosphere in terms of American foreign policy? And Carlos, you might want to reflect on it regarding Cuba and the whole question of normalization of relationships between the United States and Cuba, which is something that has accelerated greatly this year. So would you like to comment, talk to that point?
Well, I probably have a very biased opinion about
that. Well, we all have biased opinions. That's okay. We're just.
I think
this is just us. We're talking.
I think that every opportunity we've had in this government to negotiate something of substance has been blown. Right now in Cuba, the deal that it made with the United States is really a photo op and more open to travel and whatever. And I was in the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, and we were having a debate about Cuba. I said I was not part of it. It was a panel, and it went for 2 hours about opening it up for Cuba or not. Then the chairman asked me, Carlos, could you comment? You haven't asked any question, could you comment? And I said, well, there have been two sides, and we've been talking 1 hour about one side, 1 hour the other side. If you want to understand Cuba, it's one word. Only one word instead of so many words. And everybody, what is the word? Credit. All that Castro wants is credit. Because they've been very, very, 100% very, very dependable. They have borrowed from the whole world, including Russia, billions, from the European nations. He hasn't paid back 1 penny. I mean, they're very accurate about that. So the only thing that Castro wants is credit. Now, Cuba is really down in the dumps, way down in the dumps. And the only thing maintaining Cuba is the checks from the Cubans that are going over there, and a little bit of tourism, which is like a third-class tourism. So this was a great opportunity. And the oil from Venezuela, even that is dwindling, because Venezuela has to pay. I mean, they can't even. They used the Cuban model, and they took a great country and ruined it. I mean, how can you ruin a country with billions of dollars of revenue? Well, take the Cuban model, and it's great. Now they have lines for toilet paper for 2 blocks long. Okay, it's a beautiful model, the Cuban model. So anyway, but going back to it's a great opportunity to have negotiated human rights in Cuba, to negotiated many things, and they didn't do anything. They didn't negotiate anything. In fact, the only thing they did is very similar to the Guantanamo 5 guys that we let go, who are bad characters. We took 5 spies convicted in the United States, Cuban spies, one of them very highly placed in the State Department, and we gave them back to Cuba without really exchanging for anything, nothing. We're not getting anything in exchange. And in Cuba, so what has happened since then is that they have now, the Castros feel more in power, more with the blessed United States, and they have actually gotten a stronger hand against political prisoners into beating people down and if you want to see something, go to a website called the Real Cuba, and you'll be seeing housewives, even a lot of black people with pots and pans on the street, and the Cuban Reactionary Force, which is a Cuban Gestapo, going and beating them. There's another group of women, and you can Google them. I've been to the Bay of Pigs. I've been also with the CIA missions. I've been with the Navy. I was an instructor of the SEALs in the Navy. I was an officer in the United States Navy. And I'll tell you, courage, this women that are called Damas de Blanco have more courage than anybody I know. These women are wives, grandmothers, sisters of political prisoners, sisters. And they dress in white. They go to the cathedral in Havana. They attend mass. Then they take a flower arose, and they marched to the Interior Department to ask for the release of their loved ones. And invariably, the Cuban reactionary forces come and beat the hell out of them. Okay, the leader has died in the hospital, and every month they go ahead and do it again. This has more courage than anybody I know, and I've been into a lot of situations. So that's the situation. That's my very biased opinion.
Well,
we haven't got anything in return. In fact, we made matters worse, and we're given oxygen. We took oxygen into a dying. The Castro brothers, we give them oxygen.
Yeah.
The incredible thing to me is that 53 years later, we're still talking about the Castro, and they're still in power.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it?
Yes, it's amazing. It's amazing. And it doesn't surprise me that Fidel was willing to blow up the whole island, because his ego is so big that he doesn't care about the people. In fact, they purposely have all the people down because it's the old communist Marxism. And by the way, he lied when he was opposed to Batista and all that, and the elections we were having, he was transmitting from the mountain, saying all the time he was a Democrat. He just wanted to, and you can see his speeches going back to that time, and he lied about everything, like that many people do. And he said, I just want to restore the Constitution of Cuba and be a Democrat and the whole thing. And it was until May of '61, a month after, that he got on the steps of the Universidad de Havana, and then he said, after lying for 2 years right here in the United States, at the UN, everywhere, that said, I am a Marxist-Leninist. I always been one. Okay, it was only when he secured power completely, and after the Bay of Pigs, that he declared what he really was. Because these people are chameleons and they're liars about everything. And to me, it's amazing that these gangsters, because they're not communists, they're gangsters, okay, and bloody gangsters are still in power. So
it'll be interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see how the transition of power evolves as the Castros inevitably move out of power.
And I will say you something: the people are in misery, okay. And there was a report. Don't believe me. Reported there was a KBG colonel that was stationed in Cuba for 10 years. Then went back to Russia, Soviet Union, when it collapsed. He wrote a report, about the Castros, and I knew all this. But Fidel himself had 12 homes along the coast of Cuba, totally fully equipped with ham, air conditioned, food, servants, and 3 yachts. His favorite thing, unfortunately, is the same thing I love to do, is diving and spearfishing. And had 3 yachts. So the yachts and the houses would be ready for him to fly on a moment's notice and go fishing. I mean, they live like kings. They've taken over homes, places, or whatever. They live like kings. They're not communists. They're totally gangsters. In fact, Forbes published about 10 years ago the billionaires of the world, and Castro was right there. And after that, if you notice that, the next year he didn't show up because he threatened the editors of Forbes. If you put me in that list again, I'm going to kill you guys. So they took him out of the list. So anyway, that's what I think about the opening of Cuba. The other thing, from a moral standpoint, I have a problem. I was in Canada the other day. The Canadians go there a lot. And naturally, they don't know anything about politics, so I don't blame a lot of people who go to Cuba. But basically, they went to Cuba and said, we went, and the price was great, and the resort, and we had all the food in the world, and whatever. I said, well, do you ever think that you're going there, and the people of Cuba cannot go to a restaurant? They cannot eat with they cannot even get an aspirin. So you're going to a country to enjoy the country on the backs of people that are in the suffering and the misery of the country. And they went, God, we never thought about that.
One of the really interesting things that the people who are promoting tourism in Cuba have been talking about is the fact that up until there was tourism, there were no restaurants in Cuba.
Right.
And so they've only been developed in recent years, so it's kind of an interesting thing. John, so immigration issue is a huge issue in this year's political climate. But we have 12 to 15 million Mexican citizens living in the United States. They're called illegals by some, undocumented by some, but they're here in the United States. And they have an impact on the American economy, and they have an impact here in Fort Worth. And so, from your experience, what are the challenges in terms of economic development and in terms of those issues associated with the number of citizens from many different nations that are in the United States?
Well, I think from a Hispanic Chamber standpoint, we are a business organization first and foremost. And so our primary mission is to help, my number one job is to help grow business. We are a Hispanic chamber, and we were, as many chambers were started many years ago. We were established back in the 70s by a small group of Hispanic businessmen. But over the years, we have become much more to this community and to this state and to the United States. And so we are now the largest or the fastest growing demographic. And that's both whether you were born here, my father was born in Mexico. And so when you have immigrants here for generations, for decades, you acclimate the best you can. And that goes back to any nationality. You send your kids to school, you start a business, or you work for a company. And so here at the Chamber, what we do is we help sometimes interpret the legislative policies that are given to us. So my primary job from a legislative standpoint is to go, okay, this is what's been passed down from our politicians, and we help interpret those to our community, to our business people, and much more nowadays to our educators, because whether you're from here, your parents were from here, your grandparents are from here, or from Mexico, we help people at the end of the day assimilate to living here in the United States, but also prospering. So from our standpoint, we have to help them grow their business. We also have extended into the community because the kids of today, and I've heard several statistics, but here in Fort Worth, we're approximately 40% of the demographic. And so from a chamber standpoint, we have to start with the kids, get them educated, have them prospering in this town for the betterment of Fort Worth, not for the Hispanic community, but for Fort Worth in general. So educating them, training them, helping them acclimate as good, prosperous, productive citizens of Fort Worth. So from an immigration standpoint, that is a sticky subject for us. We are a partisan organization, but it's something that we face every day. So some of the drawbacks of that, for example, here at TCC, they're probably about 1% of undocumented students. They are free to take classes anytime they like. The problem becomes is when you acquire that degree, now what do you do with it? Because you're still face that wall at the end of the day that says there are some corporations that cannot employ undocumented, whether you're educated or not. And so I think if we could look past the stigma, if you will, of immigrants coming from Mexico just to do the menial labor jobs, I think I can make a strong argument that there are a lot of educated Mexican immigrants coming to the United States because one thing that I hear probably more than any other statement is that they believe in the American dream. They want to come here, make a better life for their family, for their kids, for their generations. And so that means educating, working, and giving back to the community. So I think it's a long answer to say that immigration is at the forefront of what we have to face as a Hispanic chamber. But I think from our standpoint, we're just trying to help our people get to that next level.
Juan, let me skip you for a minute, David. Juan, you've been working in the area of immigration for many years now, both from an American perspective and from a Mexican perspective. Can you comment on? I guess I have two questions. One is do you see the immigration of citizens from Mexico and from other nations in Central and South America as a major problem in the United States? And if so, how do we rectify that problem?
Can you speak into the microphone?
Most Americans, most U.S. citizens in the United States,
in polls done by, research done by Migration Policy Institute, universities, et cetera, agree that up to 70-something%, depending on the day of the week and how the questions are asked, but up into the 70s, Americans, Republicans and Democrats agree that the undocumented should be documented if a 5-point criteria is met. Number one, that they not be criminals, that everybody be checked out. And most studies show that now, I think we'd all agree individuals commit crimes, not groups. But when you start to publish that, well, this group does 30% of the crime, and this group does 15% of the crime, and this group does 5% of the crime, the undocumented commit the least crimes in this nation of any group. We can discuss the reasons why, but they're not criminals. And I'm sure there are a few, and we don't want them in our nation. But the immense majority of those millions are not criminals in any respect, or in any definition of the word. Number two, most citizens want to make sure that these individuals are not taking away jobs. And we have to be honest that in some pockets, some places, it may be that it's kept the minimum wage down, some believe. I'm not sure. It may be that in some towns, et cetera. But overall, most research shows that we need people. We're growing at less than 1%. We need to grow in this nation. And we've grown mostly because of immigrants over the years. We've stopped having very many children. It's kind of maybe stereotypical, romantic, if you will, but saying that having the undocumented working in the kitchen, washing the dishes, helps us to be able to have the waiters, the hostess, the accountants, et cetera, up front in the restaurants. And many of those that went through the amnesty, for example, over 20 years ago, now are not washing dishes. They own 2, 3, 4, 5 restaurants. So most studies show that they don't take away jobs. They help to create jobs. Number three, that we want them to make sure they pay Social Security and taxes. Well, I don't like paying Social Security and taxes, and today I'm mad at the IRS because they made a mistake and they say I owe money. Not my mistake. I'm sure it's theirs. Just this morning I had to send them another check. But I agree, if we all have to pay it, we all have to pay it. But let's look at the numbers and look at the Social Security receives, according to some research, up to $4 billion some years from undocumented, from some of those numbers that they get at the flea market. And we go, oh, they're using illegal numbers. Yeah, to pay into our Social Security. Many of them pay taxes. They don't take any of the returns. Why? Because they don't want to get caught. And no one from the IRS, no one from the Social Security looks for them, nor gives them a hard time. They just receive the money. But there's some, I'm sure, that are not paying, and we all have to pay. Number 4, and this is the real pet peeve in this nation. They don't speak the language. They're foreigners. I'll never forget a quick story, but I was in line to get a hamburger one day in D.C., and there was a gentleman in front of me, and there was a lady who was serving the hamburgers in this place, and did not seem more like from the Orient. But the guy asked her, the guy told her, he said, I want a hamburger with double cheese, no onions, and 2 orders of fries. And the lady, forgive me for being stereotypical, but she goes, oh, I see. You want no cheese, no French fries, lots of onions, And he's going, no, God. And he starts cussing. I told you that I want this. And he went on and on and on. And she was smiling. She was so sweet. She didn't even realize the guy was mad at her, I guess. And he goes, I told you this is what I want. And he tells her again. She goes, oh, 2 hamburgers. 1 no cheese. No, God. Back and forth. And he just told her every nasty word that many I'd never even heard in my life. And finally, I couldn't anymore. And so I tapped him on the back. And I said, sir, stop it. The lady's being very sweet to you. He says, but I'm in America. He says, I can't even buy a hamburger anymore. And so anyway, she gave him the 2 hamburgers and no French fries and lots of ideas. And he left cussing. And the guy behind me tapped me, and I looked back, and he was so big. And I thought, oh man, now I'm really going to have it from one of these guys. And he says, sir, and I said, yes, sir. He said, I'm a police officer. Thank you for tapping him on the shoulder, because I was about to do something I shouldn't do. Well, but people are upset. And they do feel like they're losing their country. And after September 11th, there is a lot of fear. And not acknowledging that and not dealing with that issue is not helping. So they must learn English. They must learn, and you don't have to spit on the Mexican flag. You don't have to forget Spanish, It says, and number 5, I'll just finish this one, but that they need to pay a fine. Today, to cross the border, still today, even though they don't have to swim, just cross it today illegally, there's still no fine. There's still no fine. I parked downstairs, I hope in the right place. But if I'm in the wrong place, I'm going to get a fine. Today, there's still no fine. And we're not serious about them not coming as documented. If we were serious, we'd make them use E-Verify, really make them use it, and we would start fining all the undocumented when they come. The only fine is sending them home. So, but if they pay a fine, $500, $1,000, whatever, if that 5-point criteria is met, most Americans say, what's the problem? Let's go ahead and document them. Now, these are political times, and try to get the politicians to talk sense on both sides. My goodness.
I'm reminded the hamburger story. The first year I was at TCU, we had a Russian politician, a professor who had been a politician come, and he wanted to go to McDonald's. We offered to take him anywhere in Fort Worth, and where he wanted to go was McDonald's. And I never will forget, he went in and he ordered a hamburger and French fries just absolutely perfectly. And the man behind the counter said, "You want some cheese on that?" And he said, "Pardon?" He said, "You want some cheese on that?" And so I had to translate. I understand. David, from a larger perspective, as a Latin Americanist,
I was going to go narrower, actually.
Okay, go narrower. That's fine.
I guess keeping with the Cuban immigration theme, as I began in my last comments, the Cuban case is unique. The laws that govern Cuban immigration are very interesting. They're being reconsidered now, but there's no sign that they'll change. So this really begins in 1966 with the Cuban Adjustment Act, which stipulates that any Cuban that makes it to the United States or that was caught on the way would be given permanent citizenship and then the ability to apply for a green card. So that was pretty much unchallenged, even amid kind of cataclysmic events like the Mariel boat lift crisis under Carter and later under Reagan. But migration and migration policy has been one of the constant impediments at any kind of improvement of relationship. And under Clinton, this was doubled down upon, right? So Helms-Burton, and then a shift called wet foot, dry foot. So we realized that it was no longer tenable to take all of the migrants that were caught on their way, put them in Guantanamo, and then eventually bring them to the United States after processing. So part of this agreement, first under Reagan in the late 80s, and then under Clinton, was the U.S. agreed to take a quota of 20,000 Cuban immigrants legally per year. So they had to enter a lottery system in Havana. They had to be interviewed by the State Department and now by Homeland Security. But the policy became known as wet foot, dry foot under Clinton. And it is the only country in the world that we have this particular relationship with. Again, so no other country in the world has that same sort of advantage. And this is obviously a policy that's promulgated in the 60s in the name of human rights, in the name of people fleeing dictatorship. But it's of particular crux right now because there are between 11 and 15,000 Cuban immigrants that are making their way slowly, some stranded, some in the air probably as we speak, from Ecuador through Central America and to the U.S. And if they're able to make it to the Mexican border, they are in effect privileged immigrants. And so one of the arguments for inequity becomes, well, in the 1990s, it was very clear that when Haitians are passing Cubans in the water, all on their way to the United States, that the migrants from Cuba were automatically advantaged. And so it became a racialized issue as well. And this was a very difficult question for Clinton, especially when he was facing re-election. So one of the arguments right now is, well, we need to do something different with this policy, but it's politically untenable to change it at this point in time. But a lot of voices from Central America especially are saying, these are people fleeing some pretty horrible circumstances, countries with the highest murder rates in the world, higher murder rates than Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it's becoming a fairly hypocritical policy that's criticized by both sides of the political spectrum. And the short of it is we don't really know a better policy at this point. Because if the U.S. Revokes this unique status of Cuba, then it appears a revocation of a human rights-oriented policy. And that's a difficult distinction to make amid the millions of people that are coming from Mexico and Central America, mainly for economic reasons. So some would make a distinction and say, well, at some point in time, Cubans ceased to be political refugees and are mainly now economic refugees. That's a difficult distinction to make, especially if we maintain a policy that Cuba is on the state-sponsored list of terrorism, which they were just removed from. They were mainly on that designation because of support for the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the leftist rebels in El Salvador. But that was one of the steps that the U.S. government had to take, juridically speaking, to start the process that is really kind of taken up where Carter left off at that point. But again, this kind of immigration policy is a political hotcake, especially in an election year.
And of course, it's not just Mexicans and Cubans. It's Salvadorans and Guatemalans and Nicaraguans and Colombians and people from all over from the entirety of Central America and South America that are coming to the United States. And very often, Americans want to lump them all together as if they're one, and they really are not. Carlos, you had something to add.
Well, I agree with you, David. I'm surprised that we agree on something, but I think, if we go back to 66, if you go back to 59, when the immigration started, it was a political immigration. It was a fear, they were executing. I had friends, teenagers, that put down with Castro, and they were executed without trial by the great Che Guevara, who's an assassin in my book. That's all he is. And so it was really, and we have people, Regina's father, the one that was a friend of JFK, they were the editors of the largest and oldest newspaper in the Americas, De La Marina, right? Oh, so you know, okay. And he was not involved in the newspaper, and the family went in exile, and they had to escape, and they captured him, and they trumped up a trial, and he was 20 years a political prisoner, and the last year he was tortured until we finally were able to get him out of there. So it was a real law, and at that time, in fact, I'm a recipient of that, Regina too. We had a privileged status that we came here, and we still had to be in line in immigration and apply for a residency and the whole thing, and apply for citizenship. In fact, I thought they were going to lock me up here in Dallas when we finally ended up in Dallas, because after the Navy, we lived in Latin America with Caterpillar International and John Deere. When I came here, I applied finally for a citizenship. And they were very nice with me in the interview until the last page of our military service. So I had the last page, and the guy was like really cooperative. And I gave him my last page, and I was an officer, and I'd done all those top secret things, war college, this, and the guy went cold on me suddenly and said, well, sir, no, I'll call you. So I left. And then he, the next morning, I get my secretary says, Mr. Wills wants to really talk to you from immigration. He said, Mr. Fonts, we'd like to go ahead and make you a citizen right away. I said, let me ask you a question. You were pretty cold. What happened? I said, I thought you were lied about the whole thing. So I sent a night letter that's that day before the internet for the young people or faxes or whatever. It's like a telegram to the Defense Department and to the State Department, and they confirm everything. So we want you to be a citizen. So, but let me tell you, I agree with David. I think now the people are coming. In fact, they were in the paper interview the other day, and this guy coming from that group in Costa Rica that the Pope intervened and they're finally letting in. The guy said, I come because of my economic dream is to be here and work. Well, that's the same dream of every Mexican comes, which is great immigration, and they're hardworking people, and they come, as Juan said, for the American dream, and I don't think they should be treated any different. In fact, I think we should do away, the original privilege that the Cubans had was because it was political persecution. They're not any more political persecution. In fact, on TV, in Channel 4, I don't know if you saw it, they were interviewing one of the first guys to come in from this immigration in Costa Rica, and whatever, they finally made it. The guy had designer glasses on. He had an i6 iPod. He had, he was pretty well dressed. And as my sister in Miami said, some of these guys come and they come and they ask for right away for unemployment, this and that, and they go back to Cuba and they collect checks from the United States. I mean, that's ridiculous. They should do away with this privilege of coming to the United States, and they should apply legally to come like the rest of everybody else. So
Well, we've heard a
I'm
number
glad
of,
we
yeah.
agree about something.
We could talk all night, obviously, and I would love to, but
You have any questions?
the Fort Worth Opera promised that you all were going to get a chance to ask questions, and we've come to that time in our program. So, are there any questions from the audience of our panelists?
Yeah, I want to thank all of y'all for coming. I've got two questions, basically. One for anybody can answer it. From what I understand, the Soviet Union would use Cuba as a recreational place of vacationing, if you can describe that. The other question, back in 1962, when I was 5 years old, my mom and I sent off 50 cents and 2 box tops for a little toy Navy frogman. And that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a frogman, just like my hero, Mike Nelson, on a sea hunt. My question for you.
to watch that too.
Oh, yeah. Robert Ballard, I met him in Dallas before he found the before he found the PT 109. He said he lived just down the road from where that was filmed at. But my question was, what kind of targets in your demolition, and did you do any intelligence gathering?
Well, I can't talk too much about that, but I will tell you that this. My father gave me very good advice. He died when I was 18 years old. And he gave me very good advice, and I forget. Carlos, never do anything you regret later in life. And the CIA a couple of times suggested a couple of civilian targets, and I totally refused. I would only attack military targets, only. Okay, and somebody asked me the other day, well, Carlos, now that Cuba is open again, are you going to go back? I said, I don't think so. I have a death sentence pending. So, David, if you go back to Cuba, never tell him you met me. Okay?
I can speak a little bit to the legacy of Russia and Cuba. When you look at Khrushchev and Castro hugging, it's a pretty bizarre scene. I can't think of two cultures that are more dissimilar. So there really isn't, at this point, a really tangible legacy of Russian cultural influence in Cuba, aside from naming patterns, right? A lot of Cubans have Russian first names. Yes. And I guess the material remnant of it is the Russian embassy, which is down in the far western part of Havana, outside of Miramar. It looks like a transformer, right? It looks like something that a 5-year-old put together in a bad dream. But in the long term, once the subsidies dried up in 1991 and 92, Castro was very bitter with the Soviets. He was very bitter with the Soviets for not negotiating with him or including him in the missile crisis. So this was a decision made over the Cubans' head. The Russians were also very angry with Castro for foreign policy in places like Africa, because they wanted to have unilateral control over what the Cubans did, and it wasn't always that clear and that easy. So one of the things that we kind of generalize and say, well, Cuba always served as a proxy for the Russians, but now that Cuban archives have been opened, a historian at Johns Hopkins named Pierre Glihesis, and the Russian archives have been opened, we know that there was a lot more tension in that relationship, and it certainly was at best a relationship of convenience and certainly not one of true love. put it that way.
And it was very expensive for the Soviets, as you pointed out, Carlos. I mean, I've often wondered if Castro became a communist primarily because the Russians were giving him money.
The U.S. was the only country. Russia was the only country that could buy the sugar quota, and so without that subsidy rolling in, the Cuban economy would have collapsed overnight.
So, other questions?
Well, it's more like a comment than a question. Thank you so much for going over the topic of Cuba. I am from Cuba. I was born and raised there. Went over, spent my whole life in communist Cuba. I was born after the revolution. My name is Janet, though, and it's the way that my father subversively demonstrated his dislike with the government. So while all my friends were Katia, Vladimir, Sergio, my father named Janet. Named me Janet. One story that I wanted to share is about the La Ley de Ajuste, the Cuban adjustment law. And I completely agree with the fact that the immigrants that are coming here are not the same that used to come. We waited 13 years for our family to finally be able to come to this country, know English. As you can tell, I'm still learning. But the ones that come, I just saw a person that said, I used to work for Castro, fixing the place when he was going to talk and reviewing things there. Now I was sitting there and it was a funeral and I did not want it to be confrontational, so I kept quiet. But my father was locked down just because Castro was going through my town to see a famous cow that this was producing so many liters of milk back then. My father could not kill a roach, but he was taken from my house by 2 security officers because Castro was going by my town. And this is an example of the things that happened there. And now I see these people walking the same street that I walk after being the repressor, and it hurts. It really hurts. So I really oppose that law. I think that it should be abolished, and it's no longer useful. It doesn't serve any purpose at this point.
I will thank you so much for that comment, and I will say your English is a lot better than my Spanish, and Juan will verify that. Another question.
Thank you. With regard to the immigration issues and the current problems with the discussions of undocumented people in the United States, how do you deal with the conundrum of we are a nation of laws, and yet we have a population of people here who came illegally and did not wait in an embassy line and take their queue and all that for various reasons, which may be well-founded. But how do we deal with that concept? Is the cow just out of the barn, or are we just going to, is that the way to do it, or what's your suggestion?
Who wants to take that? You go ahead. I guess in a sense, yeah, the cow's already out of the barn, or whatever expression like that. Thing is, we have not respected our own laws. We have not created the laws. We have not, as I said, even penalized someone for coming across the border without documents. Today, the punishment for coming into the country without documents is we deport you. Now, if you destroy property, then of course it can go to jail. But we're not serious about it, and we don't penalize the companies either for hiring undocumented. We really want our cake and eat it too. Another way of saying it, we want to be able to have the undocumented, and at the same time, we say we want to change the laws. If we really want to change the laws, then let's change them. Let's really start with using E-Verify, and watch all the business leaders around this nation throw a fit about it.
Well, Juan,
we don't want to.
Could you comment on the role of money earned in the United States sent back to Mexico and its role in the Mexican economy?
Yeah. For many years, I'd say probably over a decade, I don't know how many years, but the maybe 2 decades, my goodness, since Reagan, it was the number 2 income of the nation. It was up to 14 billion, it was 13 billion, 11 billion plus. Number 1 was Pemex, the oil. Now the oil is down all the way. And so now once again, the remittances have gone up, but the amount of people now coming as a document to the United States has lessened. Now there are more going back home than coming in. Literally. There are less now people coming in. There were about 1,300,000 or so every year. And about 300,000 would stay, 1 million would be caught or stay for a while and go home. Now it's in the minus. And we're very soon going to need people. Now the automobile industry is a whole other conversation, but in the central part of Mexico, the Guanajuato, Querétaro, Aguascalientes is growing 10, 12, 14%. It's a little nation in its own. It has now 11, if I'm counting right, maybe it's 10, automobile manufacturing places. You know, the General Motors, the Hondas, I mean, they're all there. And they need people, educated people, and it's a huge challenge. But the central part of Mexico, very little crime, very different from what you see in the newspapers, and they're doing very, very well. And the people of Guanajuato, they're going back home to get jobs. Once again, I think that we need to decide what we want to do and not base it on fear, separate the two topics of security, which is incredibly important. We were attacked in our land. We were attacked. And ISIS is a threat. It's a real thing. And so we need to protect our nation. On the other hand, there's immigration. And they're two separate arenas that do sometimes come together, of course. But we need to keep them separate and solve those two issues separately, from my perspective.
I think from a law enforcement standpoint, the fact that we have looked the other way forever in the United States with employers in the United States who hire people without regard to whether they have proper documentation or not. And the reason for most of the history of Texas is that it was absolutely required. I mean, Texas's economy was built on an open border. And so
and
Texans
down to Mexico
understand
too,
that.
by the way.
Yeah, and I have to say, you know,
hotels,
interestingly, if we go back,
cards,
if we go back to the 2012 election, I think what got Rick Perry in trouble in the Republican primaries was not his oops moment, but rather when he enunciated a very moderate stance on immigration, because he understood the historical relationship between Texas and Mexico, which has always been one of an open border and a lot of interaction. Question back here.
Yes. First of all, thanks for being here and thanks for your service. My question is a history question. All the thoughts about Fidel Castro and what happened and the evils, that's been the part that I've always heard since I was a kid and studying history. But what I'm curious about is what gives rise, just like when a Hitler or someone like that comes into power, is able to come into power. What is the seedbed? Like, what is the backdrop to that? Because the Cuban people seem to not wholly embrace, Castro, but there was things he was saying that they seemed to embrace, even though they didn't turn out to be true. We had been propping up Batista, from what I understand, and we had bought out, most of the industry in Cuba over the 40 years preceding, and you touched on it briefly about some of the evils of things going on. But what is the backdrop? I mean, what was the U.S. intervention, the policy that seemed to have gone wrong? Because Castro wasn't just a guy who became a communist leader and just decided that he was going to pick on America. I mean, he hated us, and he wants destruction to America. Like, why did that message resonate in Cuba at that time? What was the backdrop? Because we don't hear that in history. All we get is the after effect of the propaganda. So what would whoever wants to answer that.
We're going to turn to our historian.
I can give you two answers, right? So I can give you two perspectives, the U.S. perspective and the Cuba perspective. one of the primary points of quote-unquote legitimacy that the government has is that it owns an interpretation of the past. And in Cuba, you cannot escape that interpretation of the past. There are 3 TV channels, one of which is dedicated 24 hours a day to showing you what was going on this day in the revolution. There are boogeymen in history, and the history is what we call teleological, right? So you look back for certain lessons in the past to justify your interpretation of the present. And it's good Marxian history. So for the narrative in modern Cuban history, it is a narrative of truncation, of we're almost there when we have a society that is just and equal, and then some outside iniquitous force cuts us off right when we're about to flower into this kind of utopian society. So the first lesson is, well, we're about to beat Spain in 1898, and then the U.S. intervenes right when the war is almost over. There's debates on all sides of that, and occupies us for 3 years, and then promulgates a constitution in which that gives the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs when it sees fit. So that narrative is very clearly carried in the present, and every Cuban school child can quote to you all of the different American interventions in Cuba. And so that creates a perspective that is easily molded into a constant state of fear and a constant state of the invasion is going to eventually come. So you're sitting in a bar in Havana and you're talking to an 18-year-old kid who just got done with his military service and he's been crawling in sand, he's all cut up, and you say, I'll buy you a drink, what have you been doing? He said, I've been preparing for the invasion. So it's what's been called the hubris nemesis complex, one of the ways that power has been held on to. One, you have the hubris of the David and Goliath narrative, right? The waving your hand in the hegemonic power's face, the most powerful country on earth. And then the kind of nemesis complex is that one of the bastions of power is to constantly have someone to blame something on. So whenever some food doesn't get delivered to market because a truck breaks down because there's no new parts, it's somehow the fault of the embargo and the United States. It's somehow the fault of that material scarcity. And there's a counter argument for everything you say. So you say, wow, it would be nice to have a new pair of jeans, right, every once in a while. And then the response is, yeah, but you all have washing machines up there, and washing machines just wear out clothes really quickly, right? So everything that could seem as an advantage from a consumer standpoint is met with a pretty well-calculated response. And a brief story, one of the ways I can kind of best illustrate this is when we were there as a student in 2001, I was there during 9/11, and there was a cruise ship of American students that were sailing around the world, and they landed in Cuba, and there was 13 of us students there from the U.S., and we were going to be tasked with kind of taking them around and guiding them in Havana. And the culmination was an audience with Fidel at the Karl Marx Theater. And we were told ahead of time, let's not ask political questions, let's kind of keep it on a friendly basis. And so naturally, the first question asked is, what's going to happen when you die? And so we've been sitting there for 3 hours already because the man can talk. And so I'm thinking, we're about another 3 hours here. And on cue, a probably 6-year-old girl comes out of the wings and the stage, and she gives a prefabricated speech about the revolution being bigger than one man, the continuity of history. But it was a narrative that was solidly based in this one interpretation of history, right? And badly in need of another voice, but another voice in public, of course, is impossible. And I'll end with this because we've talked about 9/11 a little bit. I was at the University of Havana on this program, and I was eating lunch at an illegal restaurant, right? Because if you have a restaurant, you have to pay enormous taxes to the government, whether or not you have business in a paladar. And we're there kind of, escondido, hidden, and they have an illegal feed to CNN, which is more and more common now. And so we saw the planes going into the towers, and we were pretty isolated because we'd been there 3 months and hadn't had any TV. And I thought, this is like another Bruce Willis movie that's just come out. And for the days after that, we were fed the Cuban media's response to this, and we were told in no uncertain terms that the U.S. had shot down the plane in Pennsylvania, and that we were seconds away from dropping a nuclear bomb on Afghanistan. But the morning after 9/11, I came out of a hotel where I was living, and there was a woman who I would say hi to on the street all the time, and she came out and she was crying, and she had an old Polaroid picture, and it was a picture of her son with the Twin Towers in the background. And she said, I want you to know, and I hope you understand this, that we differentiate between people and politics. We have no problem with Americans. We have a problem with American politics. This was her opinion. But the larger point is that almost every Cuban you talk to has a relative living in the United States. And so it's an antagonistic relationship, yes. It's a relationship that's been self-isolating for so many years. But there are a lot of things that join us together. Cubans are still enormous consumers of American culture. There's a lag time of about a week and a half before when a movie comes out here to when it's in Cuba. I'm not sure how that happens. It's probably not quite legal. But yes, there's a politics of division, but it's not as isolated and as isolating as it was even 10 years ago. So the changes are happening very, very rapidly. Now, whether they're going to have a positive or negative valence, that's beyond me to say as a historian. We make bad prognostications. I'll stop there.
Well, social scientists don't make much better prognostications, I have to say. Our time is up. I want to. We have
3 more in the audience.
Okay, well, we have a couple more questions. Okay.
We have several more.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you all for your participation this evening. I am involved with Fourth Opera, and I want to say thank you to everyone in the audience for being here, and thank the opera, although I'm not on the staff, thank the staff for putting this together. It's a very important opportunity that you've provided for all of us to be a part of. But to the panelists, what I would like to ask, and it kind of gets in depth here. Do you think that the fall of the Castro regime would help relations with the overall the Latin American population? Going whether it be in Central America, Mexico, South American populations, because of the fact that Mid-America, and really I'll break it down bluntly, the Anglo-Mid-American and their perceptions of Latin Americans overall are negatively brought about when you have these dictators and throughout Latin America, like the Castro regime. Will the fall of the Castro regime and some of these other dictators, will that ultimately help Americans overall embrace Latin America? I'd be very interested to see what y'all's perception is of that thought.
I don't know exactly, what's going to happen if the Castros, they're not going to fall, they're going to die. Apparently they're lasting a long time. I hope God gives me enough help to see that happen. The junior officers of Cuba, the junior ministers and all that, are counting the days for that eagerly because they see the model of Russia. They don't like the Chinese model, but the Russia where they can become millionaires and dive out of the country. Now, is that going to help relations? I'm talking more about the Cuba itself and what's going to happen. That's a big question. What's going to happen after them? I know that the fact is that an extremely repressive government. They brainwash everybody. I mean, they've been doing the question this gentleman had with the hat is a question that takes about 2 hours to answer. The future will see it. You're young enough to see what's going to happen in the future. But I think I have talked to some of those young ministers when they've been here in the United States. They still have a vision of them divvying up everything and getting rich, but at the same time controlling. They like also the Chinese model of controlling people and controlling like the small business you were talking about. Oh, we want to keep the business small. Yeah, sure, because they don't want anybody to overshadow them. And they don't want to open. The Cubans are, even the ones today, are very entrepreneur-oriented. They're hardworking people, just like the Mexicans are. And they want to live the dream, But the motivation is not at all democracy or freedom for the people. It's about themselves. Everybody you talk to in the government of Cuba, nowadays the junior guys, are all waiting, counting the days when the Castro brothers die. Because without, the people do not dare to do anything with Castro in power. They know that they'll be, killed in a minute.
And a partial answer to that might come out of American politics. We actually have 2 very prominent people of Cuban descent running for president this year in the Republican Party, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. And Hispanics in the United States differentiate very much between people of Cuban. Other Hispanics differentiate very much between people of Cuban descent and people of Mexican or Salvadoran descent. And so there is some differentiation among the Hispanic community, particularly between about the nations of origin of people in the United States.
I have one more brief thing to that? I'll be brief. To the first part of your question, the rest of Latin American governments in general are not in favor of current American policy toward Cuba. The UN, by a margin of 98%, is not in favor of the blockade. And when you bring up this idea of a U.S. support or U.S. opposition to dictatorships, I would encourage everyone to take kind of a broader historical view of that. The majority of the dictators in Latin America that we have supported have been largely in line with our politics, especially in terms of the Cold War. And when we start adding up the body counts of regimes like Pinochet, like regimes in Guatemala, in Argentina as well, it's a more complex question, because most of the dictatorships we have supported have been dictatorships of the right.
We do have panelists that need to leave, so I'm going to cut it at this point, and I think some of the panelists will be around to answer questions if you'd like to ask them individually, and I thank you all for coming.